for being here on this evening. The lecture for this evening is entitled Prophetic Play and the Art of Liberation. Prophetic Play and the Art of Liberation. And so when we think about this in relation to Dr. Martin Luther King, we might say that Dr. King performs a prophetic type of art that is toward liberation and performs a certain type of play, which I will define and give some theological depth to. But also the empire has a performance and a particular type of art, especially in the memory and recovery of prophetic figures like Martin Luther King Jr. We might call this taxidermy, which is the true art of empire. Taxidermists of empire exorcise the life force and vitality of prophets and prophetic communities, adorning the nation's halls with $120 million granite statues, devoid of radical love and concern for the poor, apolitical quotes about individual character divorced from the Black social gospel critical analysis, dreams on Washington severed from the nightmare of bombs visited on the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the elevation and visibility of deceased Black leaders while simultaneously flushing Black people and brown people into the sea of despair. Indeed, the art of empire is codified as play, as a hunting sport that posters the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s face, but the prophetic force of his life, his organizing, his religiosity, his theology has been rendered invisible. In this way, empire tokenizes the nation's prophets, inviting, as Baldwin claimed in the wake of Malcolm X's death, a Martin for every persuasion. We live in an empire that has taken King's image and stuffed it with a dream filled with kaleidoscopic array of pacifism, color blindness, false semblances of love, love with no justice and justice with no love, non-action. And because King is not a singular figure separated from prophetic communities, the empire proliferates the art of play of taxidermy through tokenization and elevation of prophets for profit. Yet the beauty of King's legacy is that it demonstrates that trouble doesn't last always or have the final word. Empire doesn't have the final word. Empire might have an enduring word, but it does not have the last word. King's witness among the great cloud of prophetic witnesses of Black church Christianity, liberal Christianity, American civil religion, and the Black social gospel transcends the limits of the art of empire. In this lecture, I want to explore King's prophetic play and art of liberation as an embodiment of what I'm terming as theo-surrealism. So we know that there's a term of surrealism, but I want to think about it in relation to theology. Amidst the catastrophe of the art and propaganda produced by U.S. hegemony and its apparatuses, its institutional apparatuses, I suggest that we might think of King as an artist, as a poet, in line with the theme for this year, with theo-surrealist attributes and dimensions. So this lecture will explore the concept of prophetic play and the art of liberation in the wake of hegemonic play and subjugation. And at the end, I want to take an exploration with one of the less known or less explored components of King's prophetic play in relation to the 1968 Olympic boycott. Prophetic play. One way to imagine King's social gospel ethics, activism, and public theology is through prophetic play. if empire creates, if empire plays, if empire has its own particular form of art, King's response would be a prophetic form of play grounded in his personalist God. While prophetic play builds on the virtues and values and societal concerns demonstrated by the Hebrew prophets, it also emphasizes the creative energies demonstrated in King's rhetoric, King's theology, and the creativity of his activism. So he's not just simply trying to reproduce and copy what has been done, but creatively applying the principles and values to his own situation. And it was the scholar Eddie Glaude who also challenged followers of King not to just copy what King did, but to be creative in our own moment. Theologians of play, and there's actually a theological tradition of theologians of play, articulate how the God of play, Deus Ludens, creates with divine seriousness and spontaneity and divine freedom. Divine creation is not out of necessity. God is free in God's creative being. Carl Reiner points to God's freedom and divine spontaneity in the context of God's play. Jürgen Moltmann highlights God's goodwill and pleasure in creation. When we think about the exilic edition of Zephaniah's 7th century text, exemplifies a God of play who rejoices with gladness and praises over God's people. God sings with a loud voice. Imagine that. As on the day of the festival, Yahweh rejoices, Yahweh exalts, Yahweh sings with a loud voice. That just makes me just want to shout. Like, so Deus Ludens, the God of play, is free. And Deus Ludens is the ground of liberation, of freedom, and creativity. Harvey Cox, in thinking about the God of play and a theology of play, believes the elements of play include festivity and fantasy. Festivity and fantasy. So for Cox, festivity is the capacity for genuine and joyous celebration. Y'all like this theology, right? And fantasy is the faculty for envisioning a radically alternative life situations. So Cox argues that festivity is a human form of play that embraces the joys of other people and the experience of previous generations, incorporated into one's experience. And fantasy also plays a role in Cox's articulation of play, as fantasy is a form of play that extends the frontiers of the future. So we can think about imagination and how fantasy allows humans to create new ways of living, new ways of being in the future. So festivity is more closely aligned to memory, while fantasy is more akin to the future and hope. So in this way, memory and hope work together in celebration and imagination and a creative play. So I'm coming to King. Cox reclaims festival and fantasy in the wake of Western industrial society, believing that industrialization impeded on play and imagination, pointing to how schedules reduce human festivity. And if industrialization hindered festivity, then secularism and its scientific method eradicated fantasy. Like Ronner Moltmann, Cox believes that human play corresponds to divine play. So our ability to reflect and to imagine a future responds to our theological identity with the God of play. So again, when we think about festival, this is associated with memory. And we think about fantasy, it's associated with this idea to imagine a radically different future. So you can already see where I'm going with King here. So if festivity is a form of play that embraces the joys of other people and the experience of previous generations and emphasizes memory, then as we think about King as a prophetic player who images the freedom of God, Deus Ludens, then it is important to situate King's prophetic play within the course and the symphony of the traditions and the peoples who shaped King. So King's prophetic play was not produced in a vacuum. He's not a singular figure. He was shaped by the agape, the love of his family, shaped by the Black church, shaped by liberal Christianity, personalist theological liberalism in its tradition, democratic socialism, Gandhian nonviolence. And he didn't just come to that by himself. Right. American civil religion and the Black social gospel. So remembering all the traditions that shaped him, embracing those traditions and seeing him in the course of that. It is important, as our colleague Quincy James Reinhardt's scholarship reminds us, to remember the significant impact that Bayard Rustin, we just had a conversation about Rustin, made on King's understanding of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance. To not only see how King's festivity embraces the dance with Walter Rauschenbusch, Harold DeWolf, Walter Mueller, Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, Martin King Sr., Pius Barber, but to remember, that's a part of play, the joy and experiences of Alberta King, his grandmother, in which he tried to take his life over because he thought his actions affected her health, Big Mama, Jenny Williams, Coretta Scott King, Professor Joanne Robertson, Ella Baker, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Pauli Murray. We have to see him in relation, that dance in relation to these figures. He's not a singular figure. That's what it means to embrace his prophetic play. He didn't come up on his own. The dimension of festivity in relation to the prophetic play argues that King was not a lone prophet. He was a significant prophetic figure, but he was not a lone prophet. He was shaped within a prophetic tradition and a prophetic community. The creative energy embodied in the civil rights protests were produced by drawing on a diverse prophetic community of theologies and ethical praxis. If fantasy is associated with the capacity to imagine a radically different future, we can see King's prophetic play in his creative imagination that transcended the preliminary concerns of his situation. That transcended and guided us toward his vision of a universe that bent towards justice. That's imagination. We think about the dialectic between Good Friday and Resurrection Sunday. So we don't just say with the preliminaries and the catastrophe of Good Friday, but there's always Sunday that's around the corner. It's Good Friday, quote, may reign for a day, but ultimately, King says, must give way to the triumphant beat of the Easter drums. That's fantasy, that's imagination that pulls us forward into the future of hope. Prophetic play. King appealed to agape, satyagraha, ahisma through nonviolent prophetic play to imagine a radically different future. This beloved community, this kingdom of God, over and against the play of empires and its prescribed past, future, and present. Appealing to a personalist God who endows everyone with dignity and personhood, gives King a prophetic and creative imagination beyond the status quo, animating his maladjustment to the theological anthropology of the empire. And that's a key word for King, the maladjustment. As Vincent Lloyd argues, King's appeal to Black natural law and divine law in a tradition with movement toward justice that is strategic and performative, where King's oratory does natural law, allowing his listeners to find the image of God in themselves and learn about justice higher than worldly concerns. So again, we can see the imagination and how it radically shapes the right now. And I want to think about King as a theo-surrealist. I'm kind of experimenting here, so y'all get your questions ready. It is here that we might understand King to be a theo-surrealist. Think with Robin D.G. Kelly, who appeals to the Chicago Surrealist group in his definition of surrealism, where he says, Surrealism is the exaltation of freedom, revolt, imagination, and love. It is above all a revolutionary movement. It aims to completely resolve the contradiction between everyday life and our wildest dreams. By definition, subversive, surrealist thought and action are intended not only to discredit and destroy the forces of repression, but also to emancipate desire and supply it with new poetic weapons, beginning with the abolition of imaginative slavery. And that's in his Freedom Dreams. He continues, surrealism is revolutionary, written, drawn from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, toward freedom. It invites dreams, urges us to improvise and invent and recognize the imagination as our most powerful weapon. Even as Dr. Kelly takes King's prophetic fantasy and imagination as a point of departure for freedom dreams, I wonder if Kelly might imagine Dr. King as a surrealist poet alongside Thelonious Monk. Think about the midnight hour. I'm thinking about the theo prefix to surrealism. Because in King's theological grounding, in his theological imagination, it's the personalist God that animates his imagination and his surrealism. King's vision of God and the beloved community proliferates King's prophetic fantasy of an egalitarian society, of a beloved community. It's not a revolution without God for King. It's God, it's the love, it's God-centered love that animates the transformation of society. Theologian James Evans, he has a theological anthropology that points to the play that demonstrates union with God, where we might see this type of theo-surrealism. However, when we think about Evans, he thinks about God in the midnight hour, and he points to the play of those who were enslaved. And so we can see Monk in that midnight hour. We can see King at the table in union with God in the midnight hour. Watch this. Evans connects the darkness in John's account with the darkness where enslaved Africans played their games of survival and wholeness. Evans shows how God, who plays in the darkness of creation, is in solidarity with the enslaved Africans who also played in the midnight hour by reclaiming that time. In this way, play is the medium for union with God, as God and enslaved Africans played in the dark. The play that enabled union between God and enslaved Africans corresponds to the ways that enslaved Africans reimagined the master's land as God's land. This is what Dwight Hopkins would call a theology of pleasure. In wrestling with Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, Evans shows how enslaved Africans claim their humanity, imagine a radically different future, embrace their freedom by playing from sundown to sunup. While Protestant slave owners worked the bodies of enslaved Africans from sunup to sundown, during the sundown to sunup, enslaved Africans recreated, reimagined their world through playing, laughing, corn shucking, and games. They were imagining a radically different future. The umpires of empire assumed slaves were sleep passive subjects in the darkness of the night. But it was at that moment where they were imagining a new world, where they played, where they created art, where they danced, where they worshiped, where they prayed and praised and stomped their feet, making music, making art against the darkness, the dark canvas of the midnight hour. King had union with God in that same midnight hour. Let's talk a little bit more about art. And I turn to Baldwin here to think about King as an artist. Listen to the words of Baldwin. However arrogant this may sound. I want to suggest two propositions. The first one is that the poets, by which I mean all artists, are finally the only people who know the truth about us. I don't think he was talking about Cat Williams, but he might. Soldiers don't, statements don't, priests don't, only poets. That's my first proposition. The second proposition, and it sounds mystical, I think, in a country like ours and at a time like this when something awful is happening to a civilization, when it ceases to produce poets. And what is even more crucial, when it ceases in any way whatever to believe in the report that the poets can make. And this really challenges us to think about who are the poets and the artists who are telling the truth right now, who are not tokens and taxidermy of the empire. Who's creating their own beat? Who's looking at the water like Baldwin looked beneath the surface of the water? Baldwin reminds us, our society, that the artist's responsibility is to tell, to paint, to sing, to preach, and to express the truth. The artist, the prophetic artist, the theopoet, has a responsibility to God and toward community. And we definitely see King in this light. I find myself watching this little boy. Little boy is called MC Abdul. Have y'all heard of MC Abdul? He's a little boy from Palestine. And if you look him up on YouTube, you'll see him rapping at least 2 years ago in the rubbish of Palestine. And he says, as an artist, huddling in the corner of my room, trying to protect my little brother. As the building shakes like it's demon possessed. And we often see in the book of Mark how empire and demons are connected. Legion, we are legion. And he says, but nothing stronger than the will of the oppressed. I bomb back with my lyrics and rhymes, little boy. As a theopoet, King understood his responsibility to tell the truth about the poor, to tell the truth about Vietnam, even when his own people disapproved about him telling the truth, even when it made him unpopular. And now I wanted to turn to this unexplored history with King in relation to the 1968 Olympic boycott as a theopoet and one who is a theo-surrealist. But before I get to King, I want to show the empire and how it performs. So I want to turn to Emily Towns, who helps us to see King's truth and creative prowess in relation to the 1968 Olympic boycott, which has roots in the World Fairs, the Anthropology Days, and the World Exposition. So in many ways, these are proto-events that feed into the modern Olympics, because you have the comparison of bodies, you have the measuring of bodies, you have the statements and claiming of who bodies are and what they are. So when we think about Towns's fantastic hegemonic imagination, this is the imagination of the empire. It is the art of the empire, where Towns blends the use of fantasy and imagination with Gramsci's understanding of hegemony to construct the fantastic hegemonic imagination. Towns's fantastic hegemonic imagination pushes the boundaries of Foucault's fantastic by arguing that the fantastic is not limited to words of literature, but goes beyond to form a part of the cultural production of our realities. And this is really where we see the Aunt Jemimas and embodied Sambos at the world fairs. So by late 19th and earlier 20th century exhibitions, they concretized manifestations of the fantastic hegemonic imagination, the imaginations of ethnologists, anthropologists, empires and nations, and white supremacist power. Even Walter Benjamin, his critical analysis of the emergence of world exhibitions explains how exhibitions, quote, open up the phantasmagoria into which people entered in order to be distracted. Benjamin explains how exhibitions were places of pilgrimage to the fetish of commodity. Industrial exhibitions preceded world exhibitions. World exhibitions transformed industrial exhibitions into performance complexes. So when Benjamin says this, he's speaking in relation to the stage exhibition in Chicago, 1893. And then think about St. Louis, 1904, which is called the Anthropology Days. His claim is that we have the unprecedented manifestation of accumulation. The providers of this phantasma and purveyors of new forms of social and political distraction evidence itself as U.S. world expositions, the modern Olympics, and professional sports in the United States. In this way, the phantasma associated with world exhibitions is captured by Towns's fantastic hegemonic imagination. So these expositions, which evolve into the Olympics, they are embodiments of what we might say with Towns's fantastic hegemonic imagination. I want to just talk a little bit about the 1893 World Columbian Exposition before I move back to King. So the 1893 World Columbian Exposition represented the fantastic hegemonic imagination of the United States by aggrandizing its place on the world stage. So in many ways, what was called the White City, pun intended, commemorated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus' settler colonialism in the so-called New World. And although international in rhetoric, the White City set itself against all other nations and all other people. So in many ways, it was in competition with the Eiffel Tower and the other expositions that took place across the world. It was really the statement of America is the greatest nation. Exposition organizers, anthropologists, and ethnologists presented answers regarding the humanity of indigenous natives, African Americans, and others. So if others were to come and say, who are these people? The empire showed its picture, displayed its art for the world to see. Although anthropologists, historians highlight the theoretical difference between exhibition organizers, anthropologists, and ethnologists, they all consisted of reifying racist themes as they categorized people from savage to civilized. The darker races were at the bottom of the midway and the lighter races at the top, closer to the white city. And you guessed it right. Who was there? Nancy Green, a 57-year-old former slave and longtime servant for a Chicago judge, became the living advertisement of the fair for the R.T. Davis Milling Company, Aunt Jemima, serving pancakes. And I'm going to move forward because I'm looking at our time. But in response to that, we had a counter-hegemonic prophetic play of Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, right? Irvine Penn, Ferdinand L. Burnett, who they wrote this pamphlet to tell the world this is not who we are. As a matter of fact, Douglass and Wells argued that the exhibit failed to highlight the greatest exposition of the progress from 250 years of slavery. That the empire wants to show you a picture of who we are, but here we are, after 250 years of being enslaved. So we see this history of tokens, this history of caricatures of ourselves is at the seedbed, is at the root of what we might see in professional sports, right? And so in many ways, our athletes are performing Aunt Jemimas. I look back at 2020. We don't want to look back there. But that moment when professional athletes leverage for a moment their athletic power by refusing to play in a strange land. And to play or not to play is within the realm of prophetic play because it's within your freedom. In that playoff game, in the bubble, Milwaukee Bucks players refused to step on the court, protesting the murder of Jacob Blake. Waves of other NBA, WNBA, MLB, Major League Soccer, and other athletes refused to play amidst the catastrophic violence visited upon Black and brown people. Tennis stars skipped their semifinal match against in the Western and Southern Open. One said, "Before I am an athlete, I'm a Black woman. Watching the continued genocide of Black people at the hand of the police is honestly making me sick to my stomach." And here's the moment that I want to juxtapose with what King did in his prophetic play in 1968. Instead of collaborating with grassroots organizations and organizers, I love them, but LeBron James and Chris Paul and others, they led a subcommittee of players who reached out to one of our former presidents for advice. And that president told them to just keep playing. What happened to festivity, remembering our ancestors, those who come before us, and the collaboration, and thinking about the women who sacrificed their games? What happened to the collaboration? Prophetic play must be in community. It shouldn't be made from the top down. Professional athletes, instead of keeping the revolutionary moment, move towards symbolism in place of justice. They planted statements on their jerseys and they continue to play. Prophetic play and artistic liberation embodied by King stands in contrast to the failed opportunity in 2020. There are lessons to be learned from the 1968 Olympic boycott. We see the aesthetics of Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the award ceremony corresponding to their praxis of justice. Aesthetics and praxis must correlate. Tommy Smith's right hand symbolized Black power, and Carlos raised his left hand that stood for unity of Black America. They wore a black scarf around his neck for Black pride, black socks with no shoes to symbolize Black poverty in racist America. And while on the stand, John Carlos reflects, I looked at my feet and my high socks and thought about all the Black poverty I'd seen from Harlem to East Texas. It was the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that fueled the Black athletic fire of the 1968 Olympics. But before then, King was organizing this Olympic boycott. We hear about the bus boycott, but he was organizing this Olympic boycott. We think about play with Harry Edwards and the Olympic Project for Human Rights with the 1968 Olympic boycott that was tragically undervalued and underlooked. The contributions of social gospelers in creating U.S. American sports, and as a Black social gospeler, King's stance with Black athletes is poetically providential. So in other words, it was a social gospel tradition that invented basketball, James Naismith, William Morgan, who invented volleyball, Amos Alonzo Stagg at Yale Divinity School. John Mott said he couldn't preach, so he shaped American football. And then Pietro Coubertin, he learned from Harold Arnold the muscular Christianity in Victorian England to create the modern Olympics. So it is providential that this figure, this Black social gospel, comes as a corrective in 1968. King did not encourage the athletes to play, but King stood with the athletes. As president of SCLC, King and SCLC absolutely supported the 1968 Olympic boycott 6 demands in his own words. Realizing the protest was against racism, and injustice. Similar to the precise demands of 1955 and 56 Montgomery bus boycott, the Olympic Committee for Human Rights listed the following demands signed by Professor Harry Edwards, Dr. Lomax, Floyd McKissick, Kenneth Knoll, and Dr. King. The restoration of Muhammad Ali's title and right to box in this country, the removal of anti-Semitic and anti-Black personality Avery Brundage from his post as chairman of the International Olympic Committee, curtailment of participation of all white teams and individuals from the Union of South Africa and South Rhodesia and all United States in Olympic athletic events, the addition of at least 2 Black coaches to the men's track and field coaching staff, the appointment of at least 2 Black people to the policymaking positions of the United States Olympic Committee, and the complete desegregation of the bigoted, dominated, and racist New York Athletic Club. These demands were grounded in the Sitzungsleben of 1968. And these goals, this prophetic play, addressed racism, poverty, militarism. It had a global focus, global injustices, and the uprisings of the time, right? So we see King's contribution. And there was also at Second Baptist Church in Los Angeles, as they were planning for this protest at a youth conference, you had professional athletes, you had college and high school athletes, you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who actually did not go to the 1968 Olympics in protest, all in the church together. This radical collaboration witnessed by King in the 1968 Olympic boycott is instructional for a prophetic play and a revolutionary ethical play. And I think this is something that we can really learn and bring forward in today's time. I want to stop right here for questions and comments. Thank you for listening.